Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to extend our reflections on how people have thought about evil from the period immediately following the end of the Holocaust or the Shoah, through the rest of the 20th century, through 9/11, and up till today. A general theme for these lectures, especially the ones covering the 20th century, has been a deepening sense of the disparity between our thinking about evil, historically and today, and the realities that that thinking is meant to represent and help us respond to. While the scientists have been growing more confident, perhaps, as we saw in the lecture on some experiments on evil, they've been growing more confident in their ability to understand evil. Those who do not use scientific methods, journalists, intellectuals, philosophers, theologians, writers, have been growing more uncertain of our ability to talk about evil. And even some scientists, those most immediately and intimately involved in the development of new technologies in the past 100 years or so, have their doubts about the degree to which science itself can help us think about evil. Perhaps their worry is science is exactly exacerbating our struggles with evil. To see this, consider some of the stories we've been telling. From Conrad forward, we've seen a growing unease about the fundamental disparity in our readiness and perhaps our capacity to understand or grasp the reality of evil. Just recap some of this development here. In very different ways, in both Nietzsche and Conrad, we see a story being told of a witness of extremity, a veteran, a survivor, someone who has seen something real, unable to get a hearing when they, quote unquote, come back to everyday civilization, to our ordinary life of today, because of the nearly unbridgeable distance of their experience from our common reality. For Nietzsche, figures like the madman who proclaims God is dead, or in another book of his, the prophet Zarathustra, figures like this who are impossible to understand as inhabiting civilization in the same way that the people they are trying to speak to inhabit that world. For Conrad, it was Marlowe, struggling with the impossibility of attempting to communicate and succeeding in communicating to the refined, civilized people he circulates around in Europe, his own experiences of the heart of darkness and the bestiality of human beings in the far reaches of the Congo. For a thinker like Freud, he points out in his own work, especially as we saw in his discussion of his self-understood discovery of the death drive, how what he thinks of as unpleasant scientific discoveries that uncover unpleasant facts that are undigestible by our ordinary human life, our regular, everyday, civilized experience. These unpleasant, undigestible discoveries are met with hostility and resistance. A thinker like Albert Camus, who in The Plague, tells the story of how deeply hostile and skeptical people were to admitting the possibility that the plague was among them, and how quickly, after the plague had passed, did they go back to their ordinary, everyday lives as if no lessons needed to be learned from the trauma they had just survived. And then, in my view, consummately in the work of Hannah Arendt, who really does suggest that the political developments of the 20th century are in some ways far more terrifying than the technological developments. The political reality of totalitarianism for Arendt and what it means about both the plasticity, the malleability of human character, and also the kind of ultimately futile effort to make people better by directing moral language at them if they are under conditions of totalitarian terror. For Arendt, these facts mean that we have to think anew, as she says at one point, think without a banister about how to understand our world and how to respond to the challenges within it in order to accommodate, again, what she called the central political phenomena of our century. So this is a powerful and new theme developing in the 20th century, whether the resources we have from the past are able to help us. But in some ways, this is an old theme, and it can be a mistake to think that these worries, these concerns, are altogether new. They go very deep in human history. Remember that wonderful beginning, one of the alternate beginnings to the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is an old story, but one that can still be told. The word "still" there speaks importantly of how insistent, even 4,500 years ago, maybe more, people understood that knowledge from the past stood in some complicated, tentative, possibly superfluous relationship to the conditions of the present. And consider also, even in Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The idea that knowledge is somehow only apprehensible for what it is once it is acquired, and that the apprehension of that knowledge, the knowledge itself, brings with it a certain kind of regret about acquiring that knowledge in the first place, a certain kind of ambivalence about it. Maybe the knowledge isn't as useful as we thought it was. Maybe our concerns are new now, and what we thought would help us is now seen to hurt us in some way. The old Roman myth of Pandora's box is often used as a good example of this. Remember, if you will, Pandora finds in her house a box that says, "Do not open." All the furies and all the terrible negative emotions, all the things that will pollute human life are contained in here. But don't open it. But of course, she can't help but do so. And by opening the box, all knowledge is released. But of course, all trauma follows with it as well. The knowledge we maybe gain perhaps may be something that is useful, but we often find that we have regretted gaining it, and also that once gained, it is impossible to lose again. Nonetheless, contemporary thinkers do seem to repeatedly worry about this in a way that genuinely is new, a way that is explicitly concerned with whether our power has outstripped our wisdom in a fundamentally new way. Remember that quotation of Michel Foucault that I gave several lectures ago. For centuries, he says, humanity had been what Aristotle had said we were, a natural animal with a political situation that it had to work out. But now, we are an animal whose politics put our very natural survival into question. That fact, it seems to me, is new about the past 150 years or so. And again, this cluster of themes repeats. You can see it in our anxieties about genocide, in our anxieties about scientific and technological developments, even in our anxieties about the changing nature of culture and society in general. The deep question that we are facing increasingly today, and have faced increasingly since the end of World War II, is whether our new situation is really amenable to, suitable to, treatment and understanding by the traditional resources to understand and respond to evil. Now, here I want to talk about several different dimensions, several different genres of this concern. First, I want to talk about a series of scientist concerns, particularly founded in the development of nuclear weapons, about what they had done and whether it could ever be undone. Then I want to talk about a series of questions and concerns repeatedly raised in different settings by journalists and intellectuals about whether or not we have learned anything from the genocidal violence of World War II. And then finally, I want to talk about how both of these sets of questions have been raised anew again, especially in the United States, but actually around the world as well, in the wake of the terrorist attacks in the US of September 11, 2001, and in the discussions and actions that came after those attacks. Let me start with the physicists, the scientists. The story of the Manhattan Project is well known, and even the moral story of the project is well known. In the late 1930s, a number of scientists began to be terribly worried that Nazi Germany was using its scientific ability, which was in many ways preeminent in the world at that point, to develop a new kind of terrible weapon, a nuclear weapon. One of them convinced Albert Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Roosevelt explaining what all this meant, because Einstein was already recognized as a public figure, a genius who Roosevelt might listen to, explaining what all this meant, and saying that unless the United States began research to develop its own nuclear weapon, the day might come when Nazi Germany had a nuclear bomb that could annihilate a city in an instant. And so the physicists, out of fear for what was happening, were actually able to provoke America into producing a nuclear weapon. In a way, they are the ultimate 20th century representation of the myth of Pandora's box, the self-destructive power we gain that we can never put back. And these scientists, all of whom had started off their scientific careers in the hope of improving the human condition, gaining a kind of sheer speculative knowledge about the structure of the universe, none of them wanted to be creating infernal weapons. These scientists created the conditions for the world's annihilation, vastly expanding humanity's capacity to destroy itself. The scientists were unprepared for this. J. Robert Oppenheimer is really exemplary of this. His work in leading the Manhattan Project Scientific Research Division, which designed and built the atomic bomb, is well known. People were as eager to work on this as they were on anything in their lives, precisely because they were terrified that the Germans would get the bomb first. But as it became clear that they wouldn't, the scientists began to have concerns about what they were involved in, what they were doing. But by then it was too late. Oppenheimer, after the war, brooded about this in powerful and far-reaching ways. And he gave a wonderful speech in which he said, in 1946, in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. This statement, that the physicists have known sin, was an exemplary statement of science struggling with its moral implications in the wake of World War II. The knowledge that scientists had used had been meant for healing and improvement of life, but now had been turned to self-destructive, annihilating purposes. And Oppenheimer was speaking really of nuclear weapons, relatively, as these things go, relatively crude technologies of destruction. Science in the past 50, 60 years has now managed to work at the submolecular level with germ lines and DNA modifications that are far more potentially pervasive and destructive. Computer technology has developed in such a degree that now computer viruses, a reality that would have been undreamed of even 40 years ago, a kind of danger that no one even imagined, can now actually destroy or at least paralyze civilizations. Just consider, I don't know, in the past 10, 15 years, the growth of the word in English, weaponized. Science itself has become weaponized. That's one kind of set of examples. A set of examples about worries about whether or not science itself is something that was supposed to fight evil, but now has come to signify a kind of destructive agglomeration of evil's powers. Have we learned anything since World War II? The scientists wonder if we have. Another body of thinkers who worry about this are those who have dealt with the long and dark history of genocide since 1945. Their perpetual worry is that we thought we had learned some lessons, but it seems that we have either unlearned them or never learned them in the first place. Evil is still hard to believe. Remember that in writing Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt had warned that the techniques, political and murderous, that the Nazis pioneered would be taken up and improved, in some sense perfected by others. She says in that book, look, it's important for us to get this trial right, not just for the importance of making sure we understand why we are condemning Eichmann. That's important in itself, but also because whether or not we like it, these things are going to happen again. Once a political event like this has happened, it is much easier for it to happen again. Once the strategy, the devices, the techniques of terror are used, others will learn of them and employ them in their own settings. We have to know how to deal with them when they appear again. And this has become a deep question for thinkers, intellectuals, political thinkers, journalists, sometimes especially journalists, since 1945. Because again and again, these events have slowly emerged to explode into our consciousness as if somehow they had come out of nowhere, where we're astonished by them. But afterwards, in historical retrospect, we discover again and again some of the same patterns happening. You have Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the Sudan. These are the most widely recognized post-1945 genocides. What do we do about these realities? How do we confront them? How do we understand them? Furthermore, given that sometimes we know they're actually happening, why do we find it so hard to name them for what they are and to discern how to resist them, how to stop them? Over time, over the past 20 years or so actually, a number of journalists have thought a lot about this and tried to come up with some way of offering a template for identifying and resisting events of mass genocide. The first thing they say we need to do is know the facts, get as clear as possible on the realities. Again, think about Arendt here. The first thing you need to do is be clear about what actually is going on and resist the temptation to offer immediately a moral template, kind of fitting over the situation so that it appears in received moral patterns. If we had offered a moral template on Eichmann, right, we would have thought of Eichmann as a devil. She thinks that's not actually what's going on. At times during the Yugoslav conflict, people talked about Yugoslavia as riven by ancient tribal wounds. The argument about the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda was also one about primeval historical enmities between these peoples. But as we go on to understand the history of these conflicts, it turns out that these rivalries, these conflicts, are not always primeval. And even if they are of long-standing duration, as they were in the former Yugoslavia, for a long time, people of different ethnic and religious identities are able to live in harmony. And then suddenly, someday, snap, they're not. Why? It's easy to think in terms of evil as the primitive, right? The age-old ethnic tensions or tribal enmities or whatever. But that's never quite right. There's always some instigating force that creates the conditions because there are long ago ethnic oppositions throughout the world that never quite explode into genocide, do they? That's the first thing, get the facts right. The second thing, communicate those facts in a vivid and powerful way. A lot of what happened in the former Yugoslavia managed to stop when a few very brave journalists managed to get into Bosnia and find various killing fields in Bosnia where Bosnian civilians had died. When that happened, finally, provocations forced the United States and Western powers' hands into getting force used in order to stop certain genocidal activities from happening. But the important thing there for journalists is they have to be able to give vivid images of what happens in these holocausts, in these events. And the fundamental difficulty for a lot of these writers, a lot of the journalists and thinkers who are talking about this, is of trying to bring to people's attention in a good way what they're actually seeing, what is there to be seen on the ground. So if you read reports of Bosnia, or if you read reports of Rwanda, one of the themes that's perpetually there is always the theme of, I saw this, but I didn't believe it. And then when I tried to report it back home, people found it incredible that this was happening. It's hard to imagine that in Rwanda, in about 100 days, 800,000 people were killed, and not in death camps, not often with guns, not often with explosives, often with machetes. In 100 days, 800,000 people were hacked to death. Of course that's going to be hard to understand, but that's the fundamental job of a journalist who's covering these events, to bring home to people the reality of what is going on, getting people to see what is out there to be seen. And that, of course, goes back to Joseph Conrad, to Conrad's idea that in some sense we need to use words to make people see. Now, these two bodies of literature, concerns about science, concerns about technology, and then concerns about how to bring into view the realities of the evil around us, both re-emerge for us, really, after the events of September 11th in the United States and also in global discourse, really. On the one hand, the events of 9/11 produced an enormous amount of fellow feeling, an enormous amount of community in the United States and around the world for the United States. Seeing 3,000 civilians reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes meant a lot to everybody in the world. And there was a positive sense of hope and camaraderie that came out of that. But on the other, as the days went on, a repeated language came up again and again of the U.S.'s loss of its innocence, the U.S.'s loss of naive belief that the world had been always good, or was fundamentally good, or after the Cold War had been good. And again, when I heard this rhetoric on the radio or on TV or what have you, I kept wondering, how many losses of innocence can the United States survive? Think of it. You could consider the American Civil War a loss of innocence, the Indian Wars, the genocidal Indian Wars, a loss of innocence, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam. How many times can we lose our innocence? The actor and the writer, the 40s and 50s actor and writer Oscar Levant, once said a wonderful line about the 50s movie star Doris Day, epitome of wholesomeness in the 1950s. Levant said of her, "I actually knew her before she was a virgin." In a way, the United States is a nation that seems serially to forget that it knew itself before it was innocent. It seems serially to obliterate the dark lessons of its past. Maybe this is, in fact, though, a general lesson about humans in the modern world. That's what Albert Camus said, right? Remember the end of The Plague, where he says that Ryu recalls that the jubilant crowds do not know what they could have learned in books, right? That the plague bacillus, and I'm just paraphrasing here, the plague bacillus lurks in corners and cupboards and crannies and nooks in their houses, but that one day, for the bane and enlightening of humanity, the plague would send forth its rats again to die in a happy city. Camus thought there, right, that in some sense, the world needs to be reminded, but perpetually forgets to remember the fact of these evils. Suggests that this story goes pretty far back into history. And as I said to you in one of the lectures, a poem that circulated pretty quickly after 9/11 was a famous poem by W.H. Auden, the English and American poet, a poem entitled September 1st, 1939, suggests something of this weariness as well. He says, thinking about the beginning of World War II, but it really was an appropriate way to begin the decade. He says in his poem, "The enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement, and grief, we must suffer them all again." And sure enough, after the attacks of 9/11, a few days, a few weeks, a few months went by, and an increasing rhetoric of fear and terror of enemies began to pervade the American political scene. It was something that could have been foreseen, and surprisingly wasn't foreseen very much. Now, there's something fundamental about the U.S. that believes in its optimism, and an optimism that's close to naive and perpetually forgets the lessons of the past. a kind of perpetual amnesia machine that lets the U.S. not remember what it has done, what we have done here in the United States. But as I said, this is not a problem unique to the United States. There's something deeply modern about our ability to forget evil, something from the Enlightenment perhaps, something from the optimism of the will that the Enlightenment promotes. After 9/11, it seemed, we discovered that we had a language of evil to use. But if we wanted to use it, we seemed forced to choose between either a language of evil that provides a kind of inadvertent metaphysical compliment to bad people, right, by calling them evil in a way that makes Osama bin Laden sound like Darth Vader, or a language of intelligible or at least explainable motivations, which forbids us from talking about people as bad, as malicious, but just misunderstood, amenable to being talked out of their future aggressions. In the 1990s, the famous cannibal criminal in America, Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who I think killed and ate something like 20 young men, famously said, when he was arrested, he said, "All along, I knew I was either evil or sick, and now, thank God, I know I was sick." Right? I just think the self-consciousness of Dahmer in that moment is a self-consciousness that is far more cultural than personal. He's offering the two options that the culture provides, either demonic magnificence or simple insanity. I don't think that works for much of our world. We don't, I think, really understand the grammar of evil, and that's what these thinkers worry about, the thinkers since 1945. The imagination has very little capacity to comprehend, nor really any language, any power to represent the horrors of our world. That's why so much of the 20th century's literature, from Conrad's Heart of Darkness forward, has been dedicated to the impossibility of representing the extreme experiences most distinctive of our age. And so those fortunate enough to resist a numbing cynicism about our world inhabit a state of perpetual and repeated moral astonishment. And yet we're always able to forget that we were once not virgins. Not only has there been precious little serious sustained reflection on the problem of evil, despite what all of our thinkers have said, what's worse is that we rarely even realize this. Indeed, our intellectual energies often seem, as cultures, as modern cultures, seem to have been spent more on avoiding thinking about evil than on thinking about it. We've largely foregone attempting to comprehend it and choose instead to try to ignore or dismiss evil through some form of ironic alienation or muscular moralism, or if you can imagine it, some combination of both. And this is the crux of our problem. Modern cultures seem to lack the ability, and more particularly the moral imagination, to respond usefully to the challenge evil presents to our moral self-understanding. The contemporary critic, a literary critic, Andrew Delbanco, puts it well. A gap has opened up, he says, between our awareness of evil and the intellectual resources we have for handling it. Sound familiar? Sound like anyone else we've heard? Sounds like Hannah Arendt to me. The reality of evil, he says, has never been richer. Yet never have our responses been so weak. We have no language for connecting our inner lives with the horrors that pass before our eyes in the outer world. In Delbanco's view, we have undergone a process of unnaming evil in the past century or so. This is the story of our growing incomprehension of evil, despite thinkers like Arendt, despite thinkers like Conrad, Nietzsche, Freud, Christian theologians, the Jewish theologians, the political thinkers, the poets and novelists. We have grown increasingly unable adequately to understand both those evils we mean to oppose and those evils in which we may from time to time, occasionally, just throwing this out there, those evils that we may find ourselves implicated in. And this is the story that our thinkers from Nietzsche forward have found themselves worrying about and attempting to resist. Today, perhaps, our culture is too optimistic. Today we imagine the world as basically ordered, people as basically ordered as well. When they're not, there's something medically wrong with them. And so we can treat them medically. And this means that we have to imagine evil as the sudden and wholly inexplicable eruption of malice and madness in an otherwise harmonious world. Genocides, events of mass evil, will always surprise us as long as we think that humans cannot be good, cannot be bad. That is not so much an understanding of evil as a failure to understand it, and it reflects the fact that our culture's essentially optimistic vision of human beings as basically good and intelligible leaves no space for people who do apparently unintelligible and certainly horrific deeds. All we have to do then is imagine, all we can do then is imagine the people who do these deeds are either subhuman or superhuman in some sense. Either superhuman in their maleficence and give their wickedness a monstrous supernatural cast, or somehow they're not fully mature humans. They're more like beasts, monkeys, or dogs. Neither of these, it seems to me, is fully adequate. How do we do better than this? In a way, that's why I'm giving this whole lecture series. We need to know more about the past, and we need to know how almost everything we think about evil today, when we occasionally think about it, has an echo in that past. Even if the echo is different from where we are now, nonetheless, learning about the history of thinking about why evil exists will hopefully provide us with some resources for thinking in the future. Exploring some answers to those questions is the point of our next and last lecture.